Do you feel that in a time when we are more connected than ever, we are drifting away from real human connection, especially to ourselves? I do. Hi, I'm Leticia Latino, and I want to invite you to join me and my very inspiring guests in exploring ways to reconnect to your essence, to your definite purpose, to what makes you tick. Are you ready? Hello, everybody. Welcome to a new episode of Back to Basics, Reconnecting to the Essence of You. My guest today is Phyllis Leavitt. She's a psychotherapist, author, and public speaker who spent over 30 years working with individual and family dysfunction and abuse. She chronicled her own healing journey in her books, A Light in the Darkness and Into the Fire. In her latest book, America in Therapy, A New Approach to Hope and Healing for a Nation in Crisis, she felt called to share all she has learned in her professional life with the public and demonstrate how the principles of the best psychotherapy can be used to help heal our country of escalating hatred, divisiveness, and violence. Hello, Phyllis, and welcome to Back to Basics.
Well, hello, and thank you so much for having me here today.
Well, no, I'm very, intrigued. The name of your book and the subject of your book is something I'm passionate about. We'll talk. I think everybody should be passionate about that.
Yeah.
A non-American, that hasn't become a citizen, even after 28 years of being in this beautiful country. Sometimes I surprise myself how passionate I get in defending the country and to see very different country from the one I came into. But I'm sure that will give us good subject of conversation.
Totally.
Yes, but let's start, Phyllis, if you will, sharing a little bit about your childhood, your young years. Did you ever feel or dreamt about becoming a psychotherapist or an author or a speaker? What were you passionate about back then?
I was passionate about writing. I didn't even know about psychotherapy when I was a kid. Nobody talked about going to a therapist, and I think therapy was quite different when I was a child anyway. But I knew at a very young age I wanted to be a writer. I just didn't know what I wanted to write about. So I wrote poetry when I was very young and in high school, and I just fell in love with words. I fell in love with the connection that I made to myself when I was doing creative writing. And then I became a psychotherapist really, obviously much later in life. I was in my 30s and I wanted to go back to school and develop my own career. I had 3 little children and I was in kind of a crisis in my own life at that time. My marriage was not a good one or a happy one. And I had tried to go to therapy, with my ex-husband at that time. It just, nothing really shifted. And I got that I really needed to work on myself and find out where I was stuck and what was blocking me from being more fulfilled and more happy and more relational in my own life. And so I went to therapy and that was it. I decided to become a therapist.
That's an interesting beginning of the journey, so to speak, because I love to establish like the path. And I'm always fascinated with seeing how people like had it very clear from the get-go, like what they wanted to be. And that's exactly, and they're happy and they're fulfilled. And then the twists and turns many of my guests and even myself have taken into finding that. So amazing that you saw the love for something and then you embrace it as your own.
Right. And it stays with you. And not everybody has that. Some people don't discover what they want to do with their lives until they're adults. But some people sort of just come in knowing, and I don't know what makes that difference.
Yeah, no, that's a great reflection. And that would be the $20 million answer, right? It's like, what will make that difference? But so you, of course, became a psychotherapist and you chose a subject or to treat dysfunctional families, abusive individuals. What can you share in terms of that experience? I know we're going to talk about the books, and I love how you use that experience to now kind of make a point into what the country is going on. But in individuals, anybody here listening out there, about therapy, a lot of people are afraid of it or feel that something's seriously wrong with me if I need therapy. But you saw a little bit of everything. So what can you share about that particular experience of dealing
Yeah,
with
I
people
would
that
say
needed the
that was
help?
my experience to begin with. When I first sort of heard about going to a therapist, I was in college and I was having a hard time in college. I had a lot of depression from some unfortunate abuse in my own childhood. And a friend of mine recommended that I go see a therapist. And so I went to see the college counselor. I went to one session. I felt so exposed and so vulnerable and so flawed that I never went back.
Mm.
And so it was many years later that I sort of got over the fear of that and went to therapy myself. And it was really one of the best things I ever did. And to say, and I know a lot of people still feel like it means you're flawed and you're less than, and you should be able to figure it all out by yourself. And if you don't, you're weak or you're, needy or whatever we tell ourselves. And actually what I have experienced with so many clients over the years is that it takes great strength to be that vulnerable and to dive deep into what hurt us and make that healing journey and trust another human being to help us make that journey and keep us safe along the way. It takes enormous courage and strength. And I would love to say that to the whole world, that there's nothing weak about going to therapy. The truth is we do need each other. The truth is we're born wired for love and connection. And when we don't have safe and meaningful and valuing love and connection and a sense of belonging with other human beings, we hurt. And that hurt needs to be healed with other human beings in part. And so to trust another human being to help us make that journey is actually a sacred journey in my mind.
I love that term, the sacred journey. Um, And one of the things I love about my podcast, I have to say, is that people come in and they're vulnerable and they share like yes, I did have an unfortunate incident I had, and I've been surprised, that how many of us like have an incident or something they dealt with in the young years that have such an impact that we don't even realize. Like I was a chubby kid and my friends even jokingly would always say, like some jokes around that. And for a long time, like I never look at myself like I'm thin. Even when people say, how you stay thin? I'm like, I'm thin. What are you talking about? And these things that you deal with, they stay with you for a long time.
That's right. That's
And the
right.
parents as parents, and you mentioned family. So I'm also want to say something there because I think that's the impact that the kids feel from the behaviors of the parents. It's something
Absolutely.
I'm seeing more and more, and I'm hearing more and more on my podcast about, parents that were, addicts, and and I'm sure you saw a lot of that. So anything in terms of the family itself as a nucleus that you want to share?
Yes, and I think that's the heart of therapy today is that we look at our early conditioning and the role models of behavior, the role models for men and women, the role models for how people express love or don't express love, the role models for how they resolve conflict or escalate conflict or are invested in conflict or don't know how to get out of conflict. And that's one of the big ones that I think we carry. All of those we carry with us into our adulthood. And we tend, not everybody does this, but we tend to attract people that are similar to what we know. And that's why so many people repeat some of the traumas of their childhood in their adulthood, because it's just sort of like moth to flame. We go to what we already know. And we're still trying to get love, perhaps, from people who weren't able to love us well. Um, so yeah, our early conditioning is everything, and that's one of the things that I'll jump back that I see in our country that we don't really understand. That a country has an early conditioning. It has a history. It has ways of coping and values that have been esteemed and practiced over the years that may not be questioned, that may not be healthy. And that in the family, just like in a family, if you have certain values that are not healthy, like really rigid boundaries or unrealistic expectations or extreme forms of punishment that are not healthy but are not questioned, they just get passed down from one generation to another. If there's violence that goes unquestioned and untreated, it typically gets passed down either as you have offspring or children that tend to mirror that abusive behavior, or they're powerless to defend themselves against it. And we see that mushrooming in America today. And these are mental health issues. They're not ideological issues. They're not political issues. They're not religious issues. They're not gender issues. They're really mental health issues. And I'll just say this last thing and then please jump in.
No. Absolutely. Well, this is what we're here to talk about. I love it.
The beauty of psychotherapy and psychology in dealing with mental health issues is that psychology is not partisan. It's not Republican or Democrat or independent. It's really, and it's about bringing people back together and healing relationship, either with ourselves and or with others. And so it brings a healing element to the political divide that we're suffering from and the ideological divides that we're suffering from so tremendously in this country and that have generated so much violence, especially recently. And so to me, psychology and psychotherapy and family dynamics are the missing piece because it's all about healing relationship. And I think we're hungry for that. I think people really want that. I think people want to be safe in their homes, and I think they want to be safe in their neighborhoods, and they want to be safe with their governments.
And a great point. And I think actually that's a perfect segue because we do believe that the country is suffering from a huge mental crisis and a mental health crisis. And that prompted you had already authored 2 books. So you find your way to your calling into writing. And I love the title, by the way, American Therapy. I think it's a great title. And to go back to my opening, I do feel exactly how you feel. I love when you say psychology is not partisan. I think that's one of the reasons why I never become a citizen. It's like I feel I can be objective. Like if I don't have an invested interest, in one thing or the other. And one thing I always tell people when they ask me, I say, I can assure you the country I arrived into 28 years ago is not this country. That country, people would talk about politics, people would talk about what was going on. There was no polarization. There was no, you might like one or the other, but it was never this intense. It was never this extreme.
Right.
And nobody can argue with that because it's the truth. It's whatever path we're going down to is not a good one because you don't feel what you felt back then when I came to live in this incredible country. So tell us a little bit about, you decide to write this controversy because it's controversial, I would say. And I love it. I love it. It's controversial, but it sounds to me you saw it very clear. Like, did you see how you were going to write this book clear? And if you share a little bit of how did you get to decide to write it and go about?
I did, and it was a pretty clear sequence of what happened. So I did a whole lot of work on myself when I was a young mother. I went to therapy a lot. I saw many different therapists until I really found one that I could go like all the way down deep and do some real sort of come out the other side, healing work with. And all the therapy was good. And by then I had become a therapist myself. So I was doing this work myself, working with other people, realizing from my own clientele, which were just people like myself. They were people who were functioning, who had kids, who got up and went to work, who went to school or, had, artistic and creative endeavors. But who were really suffering also from family violence, from isolation, from neglect, from all levels of abuse, that I realized it was rampant in our country. It's actually rampant that our families are suffering and our children are suffering from huge deficits in their families. Not everyone, of course, but it's much more common than I think we'd all like to believe. And so then I realized I'm not alone in this at all. And I had felt so alone. Not that I thought I was the only person suffering, but there's just a feeling of aloneness that goes along with that. And then I realized I wasn't alone. And then from there, I realized people all over the world are suffering even worse traumas than I did. And some of my clients did. They're in wars. They're in extreme poverty and they have no food. They have medical issues that they can't get treated and they might die or their children die. or they're suffering incredible discrimination with no help. And so I realized from being a family therapist myself and having done the work that I did around my own family, that these family dynamics are either healthy or unhealthy in the largest systems we have. So the dynamics of our country, I began to see, especially recently. And as you've mentioned, things have escalated recently, which I think we all see. The dynamics in our country often are mirroring the same dynamics in abusive families and having the same effects on thousands and millions of people that one abusive adult can have on their children. And I felt like I had to write about that because I love America. I love our country. I love our children. I want to see my children and grandchildren inherit an earth that welcomes them, that is safe for them, that is sustainable for them. And so I felt like I had to have my voice. And that's why I wrote this book, because it's not just to point out that these are abusive dynamics that are going on, some of the discrimination, some of the repression of the truth tellers, attacking certain genders, withholding resources from many populations who are living in, terrible poverty. It wasn't just to call that out and say, this is not okay, and this is hurting millions of people who are becoming symptomatic, but that psychotherapy and many of the values and the practices of good psychology and family therapy are what would heal our country. We have the tools if we want to use them.
And that's so fascinating, by the way. And what do you think there was that escalation? Like I was just describing, when I came, this is what was one way, but then all of a sudden there was an escalation of things. And I'm originally from Venezuela, which is in one of the most dangerous countries in the world, where we have had the same government for 24 years because they hide in the face of democracy when in reality it's a dictatorship. Like we have had, I believe, 3 coups d'etats while I was there. So we've seen all this, like violence. I'm used back home. But here, I wasn't used to that. Like when I saw what happened even in the Capitol, regardless, like to any person that is non-American, the U.S. has always seemed so in control. So like this could never happen in the U.S.
Yeah.
And I think what that day represented was, oh yeah, it can happen. And we're all seeing unfolding in real life. And that also, it's a mark that it will never go away. Like that image that of the all power and strong country was really heard that day. So why this escalation in your view?
I think there's probably too many factors that we couldn't name them all. So I don't pretend that there's one answer, and I don't pretend that I have all the answers either, because I think there are so many different things that have converged and made this possible. So, my take is to talk about the psychological angle. And I can talk about that, but I just want to say that's not the only angle. There are, things that have happened in our economy with technology and with social media that has distanced people from one another, with the pandemic that distanced people even further, and really contributed to people not feeling connected and not feeling seen and not getting their needs met. So there's so many factors at play here. But from a psychological point of view, the things that I can emphasize that are contributing factors are having seen how much abuse and neglect is in the home and in our school systems, where bullying has become, a huge issue. Not that people aren't trying to address these things, because many people are trying to address them, but cyberbullying, bullying on the playground, racial bullying is rampant today. Gender bullying is rampant today, regardless of whether it's come to life and light and we know that it's not okay and that kids are committing suicide or acting out on each other. It's still rampant. And I think part of it, I'll just say part of it, is due to the breakdown of the American family. That, more and more parents have to work long hours. They don't have as much time for their children. There's often not adequate child care. There's not attention to psychology enough in our school systems. For instance, and you've probably read this, some of the school shooters are kids that were identified partly as being in trouble, as suffering. I think that what I read about the young man that killed the children in Uvalde was called the school shooter. That was one of his nicknames, you know. So we have so much work to do to help ourselves and our children and our families before people ever get to that place. And that means a lot of things that are going on in the family of America. And I call it the family of America, that more parents have a living wage, that they have more access to adequate child care and good housing and education, adequate education. I can just throw this figure out. When I was researching some of the things for my book, I found out that more than 50% of people who are incarcerated in America today suffered child abuse that was never treated. And the average education level for incarcerated people in America is fourth grade. This is appalling. And these are things that the family of America is responsible for. And that means our government to care for all people. If we really don't want there to be school shooters, what are we doing for our families and our children? And how can we make that a commitment instead of, it's so easy to point fingers and blame and shame. And I don't want to do that. What is our commitment? I think our commitment has to be to people, to the welfare of people. So I've gone off track there a little bit, but
No,
the essence of what I'm saying is we're in a number of family systems. We're in our families of origin, and we're conditioned by how healthy or unhealthy they are. We're in our school systems, which are families. We're in our places of business, which have they all have family dynamics. People who are in charge, people who have to comply, rules that have to be followed, values that are imprinted on everyone, standards that are upheld, whether they're healthy or not. And states are like that, local governments are like that, and national governments are like that. And the lens of psychology is, how do we make healthy families on all level? And that means in an individual family, we expect that parents are going to take care of all their children. They're going to educate them all. They're going to feed and clothe them all. They're going to love them all. They're going to have appropriate, nonviolent boundaries with them all. Not that they would just shower love and attention on one and, push another child out the door and abandon them. But we do that in the family of America. And these are abuse family dynamics, and they're sad, and they're hurting millions of people.
That's such a strong point, and I couldn't agree more. And sometimes you wonder, even I think because there's such a taboo on mental health and like how healthy are we, that sometimes I think when you hear about that mental health evaluation, I think every teacher, anybody exposed to kids, should have that, because you also get into that situation when you see unstable teachers. And it's very clear. And then they are exposed to all these kids for hours and hours and hours during a school year. That has to permeate down somehow. And the same in many other things that sometimes I think that going unnoticed, it impacts, even if it does happen in the family itself, like that, not catching bullying at school, for example, or letting it go too long. Maybe, the kid has a loving family, but now there's an impact outside of the control of the parents. That's that they sometimes don't even have visibility to, because the teachers are not on top of that stuff. Some teachers. And that just to give an example. So you can tell how many cracks there could be in terms of the mental health of an individual.
That's totally right. And I think one of the big things that we don't understand as a society, and probably as a human race, is that when people are mistreated, they become symptomatic. And there's all kinds of symptoms that people have when they're hurt by other people. If a child is hurt by the adults in their family, for instance, and there's no help and there's no escape and there's no treatment and it doesn't stop, they're going to become symptomatic. And some people become more symptomatic in obvious ways than others. some people will just become people pleasers and they just try to fit in and they do everything they can not to be noticed or to be liked or whatever. And we don't necessarily call them symptomatic in the larger society, but they are. They're hurting just as much as the kid who becomes a bully. Just as much of they're hurting just as much as the kid who isolates and withdraws into their room and never comes out and starts watching, violent fantasies. But people become symptomatic. And all the symptoms, whether a child isolates or develops enormous fears or becomes obsessed or becomes an addict or starts attacking other people or self-harms, all of those are symptoms of some kind of deficient human relations, a lack of love, a lack of belonging, a lack of safe boundaries. And we have to know that all of those are symptoms of family dysfunction. But what we do, and I think this is longstanding in human history, not just in America, is we look at the most symptomatic among us as flawed human beings. And especially the most violent among us, we call bad people. They're sinners, they're evil, they're flawed, they need to be taught a lesson. And really they're just as symptomatic as the people who don't show in such violent ways. And I'll tell you a story that I've told many times. I had a child who, I'll tell you two stories if I have time. One is a child who was wetting the bed at, they were 10 or 11, I don't remember. And the long story short was they weren't a bad kid. They weren't trying to upset their parents or, they weren't trying to do anything wrong. They were suffering from anxiety, and their anxiety was from their parents fighting all the time. And unless we looked at what was going on in the family, we couldn't understand their symptoms. And it would just look like, a lot of people would just want to shame and blame a 10 or 11-year-old who was wetting the bed, when actually what they were doing was calling for help for the family. And in that family, there was some good outcome in the sense that their parents took them to therapy. And then what was uncovered was that it was family violence that was actually causing that symptom. So if we look at our country, how much of the violence in our country, the escalating violence in our country, people getting death threats if they have a difference of opinion from somebody else, or being attacked in their homes, or, people, all the violent things that are going on, how much are they symptomatic of what's going on in our country that's not working for them? And this is a far stretch for a lot of people, because we'd like to just blame other people rather than actually look at the deep causes of their dysfunction. And I think that's the responsibility as a country that we need to take on. We can't just continue to target people and say they're bad people.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And the one thing is, and you don't want to get political, but like I noticed in my own country, a lot of people complain and yet they don't register to vote, and they don't vote. And I always say that's the one thing you can do as an individual. You're not in politics, but you can put your opinion, express your opinion, and you don't care enough to do that. But yet we want the results or the outcomes to be what we want them to be, but we don't want to express it to begin with. So that right there is something I don't understand.
I totally agree with you. I think voting is very, very important, because it's one way that we can have a larger voice in a bigger societal system. And I think what's sad is that a lot of people have given up that their voice matters. And that's one of many, many reasons why I wrote this book, because not only does your vote matter, but who you are with your neighbors and your children and your spouse and your friends matters. One kind act to someone you don't know, we don't know the ripple effect that could have on someone's life. And I think we can all be more loving, more kind, more understanding, and maybe more boundaried also individuals. And so, one of the messages in my book is that any work we do to heal our own wounds, any work we do to become more functional, more loving, more attentive, more cooperative, more peaceful in the ways that we resolve conflict is a contribution to our country, to our city, to our state, to our family, but to our country. And so, one of my messages is the subtitle of my book is A New Approach to Hope and Healing for a Nation in Crisis, because I think we need a lot of hope right now.
Yeah, we do. We absolutely do. And I know you talk a lot, and I guess that some of that you share goes on that towards that angle. But you do share like best principles and practices for breaking the cycle of abuse and violence. And you then talk that there's hope. What there in terms of your experience, your professional experience? What else can you do that is actionable? Because I'm sure that a lot of people read the book, they say that's a great title, this and that, but then they also lose hope in the
Right.
like there's no way
Right.
we're gonna fix this.
Right. And I think we have to ask for it to be fixed. And I think we have to have some idea of what would fix it. And again, I'm not pretending that I have all the answers of what would fix it, but I think some of the basic principles of the best therapy would go a long way to fixing what's wrong in our country if they were implemented on a national level. And so, one really obvious one is we see a lot of fighting in Congress. People are just fighting. They're not listening to each other. They don't sit down and listen with respect. There's not a sense that it's appropriate or required that they listen to each other the way they want to be heard. And so the role model is like parents in a family who are just fighting it out, not listening to each other, walking out, filibustering, whatever. When, the first thing that you do with a couple who aren't getting along, who come to therapy, is you set some ground rules. You set some ground rules for deep listening, because the truth is we all want to be heard. We do. We want our voice to be heard. We want our needs to be met. We want to be able to express them in safety without being condemned or blamed or shamed or punished or alienated. And so we set those ground rules that we have to restrain our anger and our desire not to listen, because what I wanted to say was we all want to be heard, but we haven't been taught how to listen. And so that's one of the fundamental things that we do in good therapy is we actually teach people how to listen to each other, even if they disagree. They're not required to agree. They're just required to listen with respect the way they want to be heard. And then after that, then that establishes safety. And without that, there's no safety. If people make threats or they walk out or they threaten abandonment or there's an implicit look on their face of hatred, there's no safety then to work anything out. And we need to implement that on the highest levels of government and really in the world if we want to have a safe world, right? Which really means disarmament. It does.
Yeah, it
Is
does.
what it means. But I'll come back to the basic principles that we can implement in our lives. And the next one is that we look at our part. What part did I have to play? For most of us, if we look at an argument we had with our husband or our kids or somebody or our boss, there's some way that we're being that we could probably improve. I could be more patient. I could lower my voice. I could make more I statements instead of you statements. I could realize that I'm pretty judgmental of you and maybe really try to hold my judgment back and listen more deeply to where you're coming from. Almost in every case, unless someone is just really being abused and they've just been targeted and it's not their fault at all, which does happen for sure. But for most of us in our interactions with other people, there's some part that we could reflect on and take responsibility for. I know that, in my own marriage, I and my husband, our first reaction is we're right and the other person's wrong. And then we have to listen more deeply. And then we have to be a little more patient. And then we have to try to be a little more compassionate to where the other person's coming from. But most people's impulse is I'm right and I want you to hear me. So reflecting might mean, I'm only one half of this. You are just as valid as a human being in this relationship as I am. And then, that goes along with what I already mentioned is once I can reflect on myself, what can I take responsibility for?
Mm.
One person can actually change a relationship. If one person tends to yell when they're upset and they take responsibility for not yelling and lowering their voice and making good eye contact and speaking, respectfully and with a normal tone of voice, that can change the whole dynamic right there.
Mm.
And if you have two people committed to doing that, you have gold, right?
That is
So,
powerful. Yes.
yeah. And so then after responsibility comes, okay, I'm taking responsibility for how I can understand you better, how I can behave differently now. And you're doing your best to do that. If you are, then now what can we resolve here? Sorry. Well, no, I mentioned I'm skipping ahead here, but I'll just say, what can we resolve? What agreements can we make? Sometimes, and I've had this experience many times myself, once we've heard each other and we've come back to a place of empathy and deep listening, there's no more argument. It just resolved itself. Sometimes we have to make new agreements. Mm-hmm. And that's important too, whether it's a compromise or, you know what, I really heard you and I agree with you. And then argument disappears, or you really heard me and you're on board, right? Mm-hmm. But one way or another, we come to some resolution. And resolution, all those things together, restraint, self-reflection, taking responsibility. And the one I had left out mentioning was making amends. Sometimes it's really important to say, I'm sorry, and to really do something. I always say the best amends a person can make for something that they feel is their responsibility is to do it differently now. That's the best amends we can make. And we could do this as a country. We could make amends for some of the egregious things we have done as a country, both here and abroad, and do it differently now if we really wanted to heal, if we really wanted to make it safe for all people. And these are big things. I know they're big things because we're still in a blame game for the most part. But all of those things together, restraint, reflection, responsibility, making amends, making resolutions, lead to the final goal of repairing relationships, and that is that we reconnect to one another. And one of the beautiful things I learned in one of the classes I had on couples therapy was before you start that process of deep listening, let's say with a couple who are at odds, you have them sit down and face each other and imagine that there's a bridge that goes between them. And each person's commitment is that they're willing to cross that bridge into the other person's world. So I make that commitment to you, and you make that commitment to me. And that is such a powerful healing image that in the end, we have crossed that bridge to one another. Perfectly, probably not. Will we slip back and argue again? Yes, we will, because it's the nature of human beings that we don't always agree, and we're prone to conflict. But we don't have to be prone to war. We don't. That's a choice.
I love that. We are prone to conflict. If that's not on your book, it should be on your next book. We're prone to. So this is also good, and definitely the link to your book. I think it's on pre-ordering right now.
It's on pre-order, and it's available on any website where you want to go order your books, and it will be available for purchase in 2024.
Very, very timely, very exciting. I know you do also a lot of public speaking. So, these are big subjects, of course, but if anybody, out there is interested in it, because this is a message that needs to be augmented. I love how you presented from, the psychotherapy approach. I think that's definitely unifying. And I do agree that what we need right now, the world, because right now it's really upside down, not just one country. It's the whole world seems to be upside down.
I know. And it's dangerous. We have nuclear weapons that are capable of destroying life as we know it. If that isn't a motivation to find a new paradigm for human relations,
Absolutely. Absolutely. So, Phyllis, I know you've been on a lot of podcasts, so you have many things you're passionate about. I always love to ask at the end of an interview is what is your go-to thing when you need to reconnect to yourself and to what makes you tick?
Yeah, nature. I have a house full of houseplants. I talk love to them every day. My husband and I we're fortunate to live in the woods, and we hike in the woods, and I love being in nature. I love just contemplating in nature or being quiet in nature. Also go to, that's one. Art is another one. I'm just in love with beauty, and beauty really feeds me. So art is another one. And, my children, my grandchildren, have some very close friends that are also an amazing source of emotional nourishment. So those are the main ones for me.
I
And my
love
husband,
that.
of course,
Yeah, I'm sure he can make you reconnect with yourself. So this has been great, Phyllis. I mean, I've enjoyed this, the wisdom. You have an important message to give, a very big one, but I do think that it only takes each one of us becoming active, applying what we learn, what we know, what we
Right.
want to do, and that's why I'm totally aligned that we need to create more noise and just raise awareness about this very issue, because I do agree that America needs therapy.
Well, thank you so much. I mean, and you've been a great person to talk to because, I think we're sort of on the same vibration or wavelength. And it's just been great to talk with you because you're a wonderful podcast host.
Oh, thank you. Thank you, Phyllis. And to all of you out there, I hope you enjoyed this conversation as much as I did. If you like it, go to our webpage, review it, and you can now leave us voicemails. So if you want to leave a little voice about what you enjoyed, what your main thought of the podcast was, please do so. And until the next episode of Back to Basics. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
You've been listening to Back to Basics. You can follow us on Instagram and Facebook. If you haven't yet, subscribe, rate, and review this podcast on Apple Podcast or any of your favorite streaming platforms. This is the best gift you can give us. Join me next week for another Back to Basics conversation. And if you want to find out about other exciting things I'm working on, visit leticialatino.com. Thank you, and until the next time.